Synopsis of the books of the Bible. Major Prophets. Ezekiel. By JND Darby. Chapters 29 to 32. The Judgment of Egypt and the Fall of Assyria. Ezekiel 29 to 32 contain the judgment of Egypt. Egypt sought, in the self-will of man, to take the place which God had in fact given to Nebuchadnezzar. All must submit. The mighty empire of Ur had already fallen. Pharaoh, whatever his pretensions and his ambition might be, was no better. We see this judgment of the Assyrian, the chief of all the nations, as to his power, in Ezekiel 31 verses 10 and 11, where the mighty one of the heathen is distinctly brought out, falling before this decree of God. Pharaoh would be consoled by seeing all the great ones of the earth overthrown like himself. Already fallen like the uncircumcised, that is, like people who were not owned of God, nor consequently upheld by him, all must give place to this new power in the hands of Nebuchadnezzar. That which characterized Egypt was the pride of nature, which would follow its own will, and owns no God. Chapter 29 verse 9. Such a principle shall no longer be the confidence of God's people. Verse 16. Egypt should have her place, but should no longer rule. The judgment of Egypt should be the occasion of Israel's blessing. This reaches to the end. In the destruction of the Assyrian, God had shown that he would not allow a nation to exalt itself in this manner. The will of man in Pharaoh did not alter his judgment. In Nebuchadnezzar, as we have seen, a new principle was introduced by God himself into the world. Observe that in Ezekiel 32 verse 27 Mesh and Tubal are distinguished from the rest of the nations. The importance and extent of the prophecy as to Egypt. This prophecy concerning Egypt has particular importance. It is composed of three distinct prophecies. The first, Ezekiel 29 and 30, is subdivided. The second, chapter 31, the third, chapter 32. But this last extends to the end of chapter 39 and embraces several subjects in connection with the fate of Israel in the last days. Observe that Ezekiel 29 verses 17 to 21 is a prophecy of a very different date, introduced here on account of its relation to that which precedes it in the same chapter. Ezekiel 30 verses 20 to 26 is also a distinct prophecy as to its date. The judgments summarized. Their result in Israel's re-establishment. Until Ezekiel 25 we principally found moral arguments with respect to the state of Israel. From thence to the end of chapter 32 it is rather the execution of the judgment. But the prophecy that announces this execution is remarkable in more than one respect. Nebuchadnezzar is looked at as executing the judgment of God, whose servant he is for the purpose of doing so on Jerusalem, now become preeminently the seat of iniquity although the sanctuary of God. At the same time, God sets his land free, by these very judgments from all the nations that wrongfully possessed it. He brings to naught the haughty power of man in which Israel had trusted, that is, Egypt, which shall never rise again as a ruling nation. But it was the day of all nations. The result of these judgments, whether on rebellious Jerusalem or on the nations, should be at the same time the re-establishment of Israel according to promise and by the power of God in grace. The snares which had led them into evil were taken away. See Ezekiel 26 verses 16 to 21. Ezekiel 27 verses 34 to 36. Thus, although these events have had their historical accomplishment by the hand of Nebuchadnezzar, the ways of God in view of the re-establishment of Israel have been manifested, as far as regards the judgments to be executed, judgment, through which all the nations, as well as Israel, who was their center, disappear from the scene as nations. The Spirit, while recounting the execution of the judgments that were to fall on Ur, Elam, and Mesh, gives details of those that had invaded the land or been snares to Israel. So that the prophetic recital of these very judgments contains in itself the assured hope granted to Israel by the efficacious grace of the Lord. I cannot doubt that all this prophecy of judgment relates, in a perspective brought nigh by the energy of the Spirit, to the events of the last days, which will be the complete fulfillment of these purposes and intentions of God. In Ezekiel 30 verse 3, we see that it is universal. See note. Note. It will be remembered that with Nebuchadnezzar God set aside the order he had previously established in the world, revealed in Deuteronomy 32, namely, of nations and peoples arranged around Israel as a center. He owns Israel no longer as his people. Thus order then falls of itself, and Babel of old, the place of dispersion, becomes the center of one absorbing empire. In connection with the fact that Israel is no longer owned as a people, being judged as such, God addresses himself to individual conscience in the midst of the nation. But this was the judgment of the nations and the call of a remnant. And this is why the prophecy reaches in its full bearing to the final judgment of the earth, when that judgment and call are to be fully accomplished. God consequently himself delivers and saves his people, judging between sheep, and executing wrath against all those who have trodden them underfoot. The judgment of the one absorbing empire does not form part of the prophecies of Ezekiel. This is found in Daniel, save so far as every oppressor and evil shepherd is judged. Ezekiel 34. The connection of this empire with Israel in the last days will not be immediate. It will politically favor the Jews who do not own the Lord. What I here notice forms the key to the prophecy. Ezekiel speaks from the midst of Israel captive, and does not occupy himself with Judah, owned by itself in the land under the power of the Gentiles. End of note. I have already quoted the passages which show that for Israel it is the deliverance from their former snares. The pretensions of man are overthrown. Ezekiel 29 verses 3-9, the spirit of dominion. Ezekiel 31 verses 10-14. The nothingness of the glory of man is shown at the end of chapter 31, and of each judgment of chapter 32. We have already seen that the fate of Meshach is mentioned separately, perhaps in view of that which will happen to it in the last days, and which is announced farther on. Ezekiel 39 verse 5. The object of Jehovah's judgments. It is important to remark one point in this series of prophecies, which commences with the judgment of Jerusalem, the center of the former system of nations. They are executed with the object of making them all know Jehovah. Only in Israel's case, there is, besides this, the understanding and the special verification of prophecy. See Ezekiel 24 verses 24-27, Israel. Ezekiel 25 verses 5, 7 and 11, Ammon and Moab. Ezekiel 25 verses 15-17, a special vengeance on the Philistines. Ezekiel 26, Tyre. Ezekiel 28 verse 22, Sidon. Ezekiel 29 verse 19, Egypt, as also Ezekiel 30 verse 26, Ezekiel 32 verse 15. With respect to Edom, Ezekiel 25 verse 14, it is only said that Edom shall know the vengeance of Jehovah by means of Israel, a further proof that in certain respects this prophecy extends to the last days. These prophecies, then, furnish us in general with the manifestation of Jehovah's power, so as to make him known to all by the judgments which he executed, already partially realized in the conquests of Nebuchadnezzar, but to be fully accomplished by and by in favor of Israel. It will be remarked that in Ezekiel 35 verse 12, when Edom is again judged, it is only said, "Thou shalt know that I Jehovah have heard all thy blasphemies." But in verses 4 and 9, it is said of Edom, "Thou shalt know, or ye shall know that I am Jehovah." So that this knowledge of Jehovah is by the judgment itself, not by any resulting spiritual knowledge of him, for, when all the earth shall rejoice, Edom shall be made desolate. It will be through judgment that all the nations shall know that Jehovah is God. But when the judgment has been executed and all the earth shall rejoice in blessing, Edom will have only judgment. Compare Obadiah. Edom undergoes judgment by means of the mighty among the nations, but Israel himself shall strike the final blow. We may see the two means of making Jehovah known in the case of Israel. Ezekiel 24 verses 24-27, 28 verse 26. 34 verse 27, 36 verse 11. In the other cases, it is by judgment. Commercial glory and governmental pride of power absolutely judged. We have yet to observe that in the case of Tyre, commercial glory, and in the case of Egypt, governmental pride founded on power, are absolutely judged, cast down and destroyed without remedy. Ezekiel 26 verse 21, 27 verse 36. 31 verses 18. Compare Ezekiel 32 verse 32. This has been literally fulfilled with respect to the continental Tyre, and the Egypt of the pharaohs. We have seen the total destruction of Edom announced by Jehovah. That which characterized Edom was its implacable hatred to the people of God.